Hey guys, what's up? My name is Sky Webb and I'm here to talk about a true crime story that I cannot get off my mind. But before I get started, I just want to put out a little disclaimer that I mean no harm to any of the victims or the victims' families, and I wish everyone who was hurt within this story the utmost peace and solace, either in rest or in recovery. With that out of the way, happy True Crime Thursday. Today we're going to be looking into an Australian case, the case of Granny Evil and her sons, one of which has the nickname Mr. Death. This is a very interesting case, so let's get straight into it. 1935, Kath was born on the 27th of March and she grew up in Melbourne, Australia. She grew up in a family that was more towards the poorer side. They didn't grow up with a lot of money and they grew up very religious. So her parents taught her from a very young age to read the Bible. But with Kath, she was a very interesting child, and from a very young age, she was able to interpret the Bible in a way that sort of suited her, and she was able to form some opinions, strong opinions that she was happy to share. And one of these opinions was that she believed Satan was more powerful than God was. And so she actually developed a relationship with Satan rather than with Christ, which is obviously what her parents had intended by getting her to read the Bible. She knew from a young age that she wanted lots of kids. She wanted to be a mother and she wanted to have lots of babies. In fact, she wanted 10 to be specific. And so she would sit down at night and she would pray to Satan, not God. She would pray to Satan that she would have 10 children. That's all she wanted. So already you can tell that Kath is a very interesting child and she was going to be very unique. In 1951, Kath's prayers were beginning to be answered. Thank you, Satan. At 16 years old, she had her first son, Dennis Allen, and then a year later, she had her second son, Peter. So at this stage, she was obviously very young and she wasn't really ready to have children. She wasn't really ready to look after them and give them, the love and care that they needed necessarily. So at this point, the two boys went to go and live with Kath's mum. The problem was Kath's mum enjoyed drinking quite a lot, and so did her boyfriend. Her boyfriend was a bit of an alcoholic. They would tend to have like 1 or 6 too many drinks and they would just become really abusive towards the boys, and from a young age the boys were physically abused. And growing up, the boys were actually led to believe that Kath wasn't their mum. They were led to believe that Kath was actually their older sister who had just moved out to go live with her boyfriend. They didn't even know that they were actually her son, which is crazy. So Kath's boyfriend at the time, his name was Dennis Ryan, and he was like a small-time criminal, not as badass as he thought he was type of thing, but he was quite violent and he would beat Kath and he would abuse her. And it's really not funny, but it's just so bizarre because when Kath decided to leave this boyfriend of hers, it wasn't because of the violence or the beatings, it was because he was too soft. Apparently, he was a bit of a romantic and that was a bad thing. So she broke up with him. Kath then went on to date a guy named Billy Pierce, and her prayers really started to be answered because between 1954 and 1961, Kath went on to have 6 children. Out of those 6 children, 3 of them were actually adopted out, so she didn't have anything to do with them, and that was 2 girls and 1 boy. And then later on in life, in the future, the 2 girls did reach out and try and make contact with Kath, but the boy never did, so she doesn't know what happened to him. So after these adoptions, Kath was left with 3 children, and that was Vicky, Victor and Lex, plus the 2 boys that she already had, which was Peter and Dennis. So at this point, Kath is in her 30s, she's working as a barmaid, she's not making a lot of money, she's kind of copping shit at work, like she doesn't really enjoy it. She's got these kids at home, she's not really bringing in enough money, so she kind of falls into sex work. She begins working at a brothel, and she realized that she could make more money in 1 hour at this brothel than she could working an entire shift as a barmaid. So she was like, I'm gonna do this then. So she starts at the bottom, and she starts as a working girl, and she kind of works her way up, and then she becomes the madam of the brothel, which is basically like the manager or like the receptionist, like kind of does everything. So that means she would, you know, manage the clients and manage the girls and just take care of everything, book people, answer phones, like all that kind of stuff. She did this for quite some time, and she built up the experience that she needed to actually open and run her own brothel. Although the ones she opened were completely illegal, but I'll get to that in a minute. At this point, she is making bank. She's raking in the cash. She worked really well as a sex worker herself and actually made a lot of money that way. But now she's working really hard managing all these other people, and she's making heaps of money. She's actually a really good people person. She was very good with the clients and had a way of like getting them to book regardless of who they were booking with, if that makes sense. Like, she was just a very good people person. So now she started dating a guy called Jimmy Pettingill, and he was also a very violent man. She had a thing for violence, I guess you could say. In 1963 and then again in 1965, Kath had 2 more children with this new Pettingill guy, and their names were Jamie and Trevor, and they, along with the other 3 kids and Pettingill and Kath, all lived in one house together. By now, the eldest 2 boys had already moved out of their grandmothers. They actually moved out at quite a young age because of how badly they were treated there. It wasn't a very good place to be. And by now, they knew that Kath was their mum, so they had kind of a weird relationship with her. It was sort of like a sibling relationship, but also sort of like a mother-son relationship. It was quite odd. But they had a good relationship with their siblings, with Kath's other children, because they knew that they were siblings now. They especially became very, very protective when they realized that this Pettingill guy that Kath was dating, he started beating the children as like a way of discipline. And at this point, the eldest boys, they're only 15, 16, as I said, moved out quite early. But they became very, very protective of the children, and they're like, no, you cannot fucking beat up our brother, like fuck off. They had the balls to stand up to this guy who was already a very, very violent guy and be like, fucking keep it up and we're gonna have a problem. Like, they were not afraid. So Dennis Allen, he was the first child, and he was later nicknamed Mr. Death. Dennis Allen is Mr. Death. And he got into petty crime pretty young. He didn't really go to school. He spent most of his time running around with his friends doing shady, sketchy shit. He would spend a lot of time doing drugs, selling drugs, breaking into places. Nothing too extreme, but, you know, started quite young. So eventually, when he turned 18, he was actually sent to prison. Now, the day that he got out of prison, he met up with his brothers for a little bit of like a celebration, like, I'm out of prison, fuck yeah, like, let's get drunk. So him and his brother Peter, along with 2 other friends, they go to a bar and they get pissed like everyone else in Australia would. So the boys, they're all pissed, and they harass these 2 women before taking them back to an apartment where they lock them in the apartment. They refuse to let them leave, and then they take turns raping them. After this, they end up splitting up. So Dennis Allen, who was the one who just got out of prison, he didn't do anything, he stayed. Peter, the second oldest child, the brother, he and his mate basically just run off, and they go off on a 2-day bender. They said that they were only drinking, but Peter on a number of occasions said he was flying, like they were just flying, they were just going. So I feel like that's like probably more than just alcohol for 2 days. But anyway, they end up shooting a random guy who was driving past, and then they shoot a pizza shop guy in the foot so that they can eat all the pizza that they want. And then he shoots another guy that was just trying to push past them, I guess, on the footpath. This is Peter, by the way, just fucking shooting everybody. So immediately they got kicked out because nobody wanted them there, and so he started shooting again. Peter shoots him in the back. as they were being forced to leave. As you can tell at this point, they were just off their heads, trigger happy little nutters that just didn't give a fuck. And this is all within the space of 2 days, so he's just like boom, 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 like, yeah. Anyway, all 4 men got caught, thank God. Dennis was sentenced to 5 years while Peter was sentenced to 14. And I mean, Peter at this point, he doesn't sound very intelligent, I know, because he's just shooting everyone, he doesn't give a fuck, like whatever. But he could be intelligent when he wanted to be or when he needed to be. And when he needed to be was when he was in prison. He started an organized crime drug ring like within the prison, and it actually ran really well and really successfully, and he actually made a lot of money, and yeah, he just had a great old time in prison. So he actually was quite clever, he could be quite clever, but he had a big ego and very bad anger issues, which is something the brothers shared. And this wasn't the first time one of the brothers had gone to prison. Obviously Dennis was already in prison, he had just gotten out, now he's back in, now Peter's in, whatever. But even growing up, the boys would often come to Kath for bail money, for like petty crimes and stuff, and even not even just for themselves but for their friends as well. They would be like, hey mom. And it wasn't just Kath's sons that needed help with bail, it was also her daughter Vicky. She needed help from time to time, not with bail necessarily, but with debts owed to other people. She didn't have a lot of money for herself. She also had drug issues from time to time. So there was a lot of times where she had like a debt to someone that had to be paid, and she would have to go to her mum and be like, hey, I need help me out. So in 1978, Vicky owed these 2 sex workers $300 and she needed help because she couldn't repay it. They were just getting sick of it. Like she kept saying like, yeah, I'll pay it, and just fucking hadn't paid it in a long time. So they were getting over it. So Kath had to take care of it. So she goes and visits these 2 sex workers that she knew at these housing commission flats in Melbourne. And housing commission is just like when you're living in like a government funded house or whatever. It was like a little unit apartment. So she goes and visits them, and one thing leads to another, and one of the sex workers starts shooting and shoots Kath in the eye. Literally got shot in the fucking eyeball. It was through a door, but eyeball. Ouch, that would fucking hurt. And Kath took it like a motherfucking boss. She was like, it doesn't hurt to get shot. She's dead ass just chilling. She obviously survived, by the way. Anyway, she got it replaced with a glass eyeball, which makes her so creepy to look at, in all honesty. But it's a very cool thing to be like, yeah, I have a glass eyeball because I got shot in the eye. So Kath goes on to open up an illegal brothel, like I mentioned earlier, and she actually opens it within her house on Stevenson Street in Melbourne. Next door, her neighbour just so happens to be her son, Dennis Allen, Mr. D, Mr. Death, living right next door to help her out. So she's making a killing at this brothel. Everyone knows Dennis is right next door, so no one's trying to mess with her. And Dennis next door, he's actually making a killing as well because he's selling drugs and he's doing an array of other criminal activities that was very lucrative for him at the time. And they actually had such a good thing going between the both of them that they ended up cutting out like a hole in between the 2 houses, so that when the girls or when the clients, the guys coming in for the sex work went to the brothel, they could literally like go to this door and Dennis would just pass them the drugs and they'd pass the money and then they'd go. So they never even had to enter his house to even get the drugs. So it was like a sneaky little thing, which yeah, like they were just doing really well and working together, and it was crazy, honestly. And Dennis, he was making as much money as Kath was, but he wasn't as smart as Kath was. He would basically spend all of his money on more drugs or on gold chains, because he liked to be all like chained up. He'd have a lot of gold chains and like that kind of stuff, and mostly just superficial things that didn't really benefit him or the family or anyone really. That was until Kath had the bright idea to actually start buying up the entire street. So between her and Dennis, they start buying every house in the street. This was fucking genius because it means there's no nosy neighbors, there's no like civilians gonna accidentally stumble across like a brothel or a fucking drug den. Like everyone around them was reliable people. They started moving family into the houses that they were buying, and then they started moving like friends and people part of their like inner circle all around them. So there was a lot less chance of anybody catching on to what they were doing because they were surrounded by people that they trusted. They went on to own up to 40 properties. 40! So obviously at this point, Kath is the mastermind behind everything. She's in charge of the finances. She's the one making the rules, calling the shots, doing all of that. She's the one that's cutting the drugs, which means like putting, you know what it means. She's the one packing the drugs. She's putting like, she would do red or green dots on the foil that she would pack them in so that when she gave them to the boys, it was easy for them to distribute and they didn't have to like double check anything. They literally were just handing it out. So green meant go, which was like speeding up, like crack or meth, and then red meant stop, slow down, which was heroin. So it was just really, really easy for the boys. They didn't even have to think. And Dennis, he wasn't just doing nothing. He was the one reeling everybody in. So he would actually give out free drugs a lot. He was very generous because he had the money obviously to do it. But there was a plan behind this. So he would give out the free drugs and he'd become very close with people. He would like socialize and make friends, you know what I mean? And he would get real close with someone and then he'd be like, why don't you snort it? It's better if you snort it like I do. He'd talk him into snorting it, and then a couple weeks later he'd be like, why don't you just shoot it like I do, it's so much better. Next minute they're shooting it and they're a full-blown addict, and then they're a long-term customer. So this is how he kind of took over the game, because he would just fuck with people and manipulate them into literally being addicts. And besides him just doing all that, he was also the muscle. So he actually got together like a gang, and it was a group of boys and he called them his soldiers. So they were like security kind of thing for Kath. That wasn't enough though. It wasn't enough to just have like manpower. They also wanted like machinery. So they would cut out holes similar to how they did between the houses, all over the houses, all over the 40 properties, and just stash guns everywhere. There was guns, there was knives, there was machetes. It was just like insane. So much weaponry. It was like so not necessary. They even had like samurai swords. They had just a lot of crazy shit, and they would hide them in all these hidey holes as well as the backyard, and their houses sort of backed over onto railroads. So Dennis would literally like run over the railroads and hide stuff under like the tracks and stuff. So Vicky, Kath's daughter, she didn't have a lot to do with this like organized crime side of the family, but she did have a son who would end up working for Dennis. His name was Jason, and he was the first grandchild of the family, and he ended up being one of Dennis's soldiers. So obviously we know by now that Dennis, he kept those women locked in the hotel and, you know, did what he did to them. Basically, if he saw a woman that he thought was like good looking and he liked her, he would be like, all right, I want it. Like, that's the level of ego that he had. So at one point he sees this woman that he wants, he has her over, and then he just doesn't let her leave. So he rapes her, he sodomizes her, he bashes her. He keeps her drugged up. She was already like a drug user, but he, you know, fed into it. He was very manipulative like that. And then when he would leave, he would be like, all right, Jason, look after her, don't let her leave. Like, Jason's 15 at this point, you know, so it's really messed up. And at one point she tried to escape. She made it out of the house, ran all the way down the block, and then ran into 3 people with guns at her head. This is what happens when you own the entire street. They were just doing this because they were under Dennis. Like, just because Dennis said so. They didn't give a fuck about this woman's life just because Dennis said so. This is the level of power that Mr. Death had. It's insane. So she was taken back to the house. She was chained up this time. She was punished. She had her head pushed into water. And this girl's name was Jenny. So at this point, Jenny was basically forced to be like Dennis's girlfriend. She had to play the role as his girlfriend. So over time, she sort of learned to just live with it. And if she did her part and acted liked the girlfriend and cooked and cleaned and did her drugs and had sex with him, then she would have a little bit more freedom and she could hang out with her friends, which were just his friends that would come over for drugs. Do you know what I mean? But it was more of a life than it was to just be completely captive, even though she's still captive. That being said, she has always said that she is the lucky one, because out of all of Dennis's girlfriends, she's like the only one who's still alive. So at this point, Dennis's drug use started to get really bad, and he was quite bad on speed. He would take a lot of speed, which keeps you up, and he would stay up for like weeks at a time. And when your body is deprived of sleep for that long, you start to have hallucinations, you start to have issues with your brain and your mood and everything. And he already had anger issues, so he would have very bad spouts of like anger and rage, and there was times where he would just run out and start shooting his gun up in the air because he thought there was like helicopters coming at him. Like it got to a point where he was losing his mind. So at this point, the police really started coming down pretty hard on Dennis and Kath, and they would do police raids and they'd come and check the house for weapons and they'd do this and that. But as nuts as Dennis was, Kath taught him well. She was very smart. She knew the laws, and they knew the laws around weapons. So they knew where to hide the weapons, because if the weapon was on this side of the fence, they'd get away with it. Like small stuff like that where it's like loopholes. He just got worse and worse on the drugs, and his mind got worse and worse. At this point, he started killing his own men. So this is a point where people were like really afraid of him. At one point, he was having like a little gathering at his house, and by little I mean little. It was him, his girlfriend Jenny, Jason, and then two friends. One man and I think his girlfriend, or two men and one girlfriend. And he shoots one of his men, and then he shoots again and again and again and again, and then he's screaming at Jason, go get me another fucking gun. So Jason goes and gets him a gun. He shoots him again. At this point, Jason, he's still 15, bro. He's puking everywhere because he's seen a man being murdered over and over and over again in front of him. But that doesn't discourage Dennis at all. He continues until he finishes the clip or whatever. And then he gets on his hands and knees and he slits the man's throat. This is one of his men. This is one of his soldiers. This is someone who's loyal to him. So everyone who was present, they were all forced to burn their clothes, and Jenny had to clean everything up. She was forced to clean up the entire mess, which I can't even imagine how disgusting that would be. And Dennis's soldiers, they helped get rid of the body, which goes to show again their loyalty to Dennis, because this was one of their men. This was like a friend of theirs. And Kath, this goes to show how evil she is. This is why she's called the evil granny. She didn't give a fuck that Dennis killed this man. She didn't give a fuck that this was someone who was loyal to her as well. She didn't give a fuck. The only thing she cared about was that Jenny fucked up her vacuum cleaner while she was trying to clean up the crime scene, the murder scene. That's all she cared about, was her vacuum. This is actually quite similar, just the attitude between Kath and Dennis. That one time Dennis sold bad drugs. He had cut them with some bad shit, sold bad drugs of heroin, and he killed 5 people. 5 people OD'd the very next day from the drugs that he sold them. And instead of caring that he had just killed 5 people that he knew that were long-time customers, the only thing he cared about was the fact that his haircut, his hair appointment, was cancelled the next day because his barber died from the drugs that he sold him. So it's a Hoover and a haircut. That's all the fuck they care about. Like, what? And Dennis actually was very used to seeing people OD around him. Obviously, when you're in that sort of drug lifestyle and selling drugs and doing all that, you're gonna see people ODing. Like, the chances of that are just there. You're gonna see it. And so he knew exactly what to do. And Kath would actually call him multiple times for his help to try and like revive someone after they had OD'd. So what he would do is, if someone was ODing on heroin, he would give them a shot of speed and alcohol, and it would like sort of like shock start them back like alive. Like, I don't really know of it. but he'd like shock start them. And as I said, Kath would call him all the time. So there was this one time that Kath calls him over to the brothel because one of her girls has OD'd on heroin and she needs him to do his business. So Dennis comes over, he's supposed to be doing his little speed injection thing, but he calls out to Jason instead and he says bring him a bucket of water. So Jason does what he's told, like he always does, and next minute Dennis is pouring mouthfuls of water down this woman's throat. Second later, and he's dunking her head in this bucket of water and drowning her. This poor girl's name was Helga, and after he had drowned and murdered her, they got rid of her body, they threw her in the river, and this is where things get a little bit more crazy. So the police, they found Helga's body in the river and they were going to have like an coroner's inquest. So the morning that this inquest was supposed to happen, the building that it was supposed to happen in sort of blew up a little bit. There was bombs, there was explosions that went off, and it was actually at the hands of Kath's youngest son, Jamie Pettingill, that they had sort of roped him in, and he went and set off petrol bombs at this building so that this inquest didn't happen. It was like a fuck you to the police and a fuck you to the system. And only a couple of days after Jamie sent off these bombs, he died. He overdosed at the age of 21. He overdosed on heroin, and that is super young. That's how old I am right now. The thing about his death though was that it was a massive overdose, and he was a drug addict, don't get me wrong, but it was enough heroin in that fucking needle to kill 3 people. Literally as soon as I like saw that and heard that when I was researching, I was like, that has got to be a setup, like that has got to be a hot shot. And then I went on to find out that Kath thought the exact same thing. She thought that someone had hot shotted her son, which basically means like did it to him. She was like so convinced that it was like a planned thing and someone had done it to him, but there was just never any evidence of it. So everyone ended up just thinking that Kath was like delusional and like upset because it was her son, but I don't know, I thought that was weird too. Back to Dennis, the next person that he killed was a Hells Angel bikie guy. So that's a pretty high profile guy to kill. And they had worked pretty closely with each other in the past. And Dennis took him back to one of the houses that they owned that he was now using for body disposal. That's how many people he was killing, that he had a whole house dedicated to disposing the bodies. So the house was all boarded up, all blacked out, the floors were all covered in plastic, the walls, everything was all covered. And he cut this Hells Angel bikie guy into pieces. He actually struggled quite a lot. It's not funny, I don't know why I'm laughing. He struggled with the legs, so he had to actually chainsaw through the legs to like get them into pieces. So basically, after he went through this long, gross process, he chucked him into a barrel and then threw him in the Yarra River. He threw the barrel in and it floated. It didn't go down as far as what Dennis must have thought that it would, so it was visible, and so someone called the police. So the police found it, found the body, tracked down Dennis and arrested him. So get this, the police questioned Dennis, and Dennis makes a deal with them that he will tell them who the murderer is and give them all the details as to who the murderer is, and he throws his mate under the bus. His mate helped him get rid of the body, but had nothing to do with the murder. All he did was like put the body in the river, which obviously is fucked up and a crime within itself, but he literally switched roles and his mate went down and went to prison instead of him. Like, how did Dennis get away with that? That is insane. In 1987 though, Dennis's life of crime came to an end. His mates ended up snitching on him and going to the police about one of the many murders that they saw him commit. And while he was awaiting trial for this murder charge, his first murder charge, despite killing multiple people, up to 12 recorded, like based off of everyone else's testimonies, he died of a heart attack. So that's now 2 sons that are dead, one son who's still in prison for all those shootings at the beginning. There's 2 sons who are sort of minor criminals at this point. They weren't as big as Mr. Death, Mr. Dennis, Mr. D. And then Vicky, she's sort of doing her own thing, while her son, Jason, was obviously one of the soldiers and sort of involved. So this was the perfect time for Kath's younger sons, the minor criminals, to kind of step up and fill in for like Dennis, you know, they kind of stepped up at this point. Victor Pierce in particular became sort of a big name, and he was one of Kath's middle children, and he was similar to Dennis in the way that he was sort of raised around all this stuff. Obviously he had his older brothers to sort of, you know, highlight the life of crime that they lived and whatever. So he was a petty criminal from like a very young age, same way that Dennis was, but he was smarter than Dennis was. He wasn't a loose cannon the way that Dennis was, and he wasn't into drugs the way that Dennis was. He was more of like a burglar. And it's kind of strange, but the police said themselves, like the police and the detectives said that they held more respect for Victor than they did for Dennis, than they ever did for Dennis. Not because Victor was a better person, in fact they believed he was worse, but because everything that Victor did was done for a reason and it had a purpose, whereas Dennis would just willy-nilly do whatever the fuck he wanted and like kill someone here and kill someone there, and like it didn't matter, it was senseless. And so they said they had more respect for the person who was doing it like purposely, like for a reason. Does that make sense? And don't get me wrong, he was as cold-hearted and as ruthless as all the rest, but he wasn't just going to shoot you in the foot on a bender for some pizza. Do you know what I mean? So Victor's main gig, as I said, were burglaries, and he would do a lot of armed robberies. He would often rob like those armored trucks that have a lot of money in them. And he would do this with two of his close friends, two of his close mates that he considered to be, you know, very trustworthy. He didn't trust just anyone. And one of his mates was named Graham Jensen. So they would do a lot of these robberies together, but there was one instance where a robbery sort of went wrong and there was a casualty and somebody died, and the police knew that they had something to do with it. So basically what the police did is they set up like a sting where they were going to come in and arrest them. But Graham, he noticed the cars and he sort of noticed the police, the detectives. He like they weren't dumb. They knew that they were about to make an arrest. So he actually goes to pull out his gun, and before he can even do so, they shot him and they killed him. This was brutal for Victor. He was not happy about this at all. Like, this was his main man, like this was his dude, you know what I mean? Like, they were best friends and they'd been doing this stuff for a long time together. So for him to be killed by the police was like horrible. And he didn't view the police as like the police, he viewed them as like a rival gang almost. So it's like, if they were a normal gang and they kill one of my men, I'm gonna kill one of their men. Like, that's how he viewed it. So in 1988 this happened, and 13 to 14 hours after Graham's death, two police constables get a phone call about an abandoned car on Walsh Street. So these two constables, they rock up, they check it out, they get inside the car, one of them writes down, you know, the details, the license plate, and they're just sort of looking around for, you know, what could help them identify the car. And then comes four men approaching the car wearing either like a face mask or a face covering with guns, and they start shooting. So one of the shooters, he had a shotgun and he shoots the first constable, Constable Tynan, and he dies straight away in the driver's seat of this car. The second constable, Air, he was wounded, but he actually managed to sort of struggle with the guy with the shotgun for a little bit of time before one of the other men actually come up behind him, grab his own gun, like the policeman's gun, and shoots him from behind. So he was shot point blank in the back of the head by his own revolver. So this incident was nicknamed the Walsh Street Shootings, and it was a tremendously big deal at the time. It was huge. This was a big deal because it meant that these two deaths were completely random. It could have been any policeman to rock up there and they would have been killed. So there was a huge public pressure to find the people responsible for these deaths, because the public felt very unsafe that the police were randomly being like slaughtered. So the next day, a huge squad of police, They all rock up to Victor's house and they are ripping it to shreds. They are looking for any bit of evidence that they can find. They're looking in the walls, they're digging up the floors, they're looking in the backyard. They're looking over every single inch of this man's property, and they actually ended up getting a warrant to demolish the house. They demolished the house, trying to look for evidence to connect him to the Walsh Street shootings, but they couldn't find anything. And they were like 98% sure that it was Victor who like committed these murders. He promised he would get revenge because they killed his best friend. This happened 13 hours afterwards. Like, no, this was him. They were so certain. That being said, Victor's not the only one that they cracked down on. The police had a massive crackdown on guns, on drugs. Like, they were making arrest after arrest after arrest. People were getting done for firearms, for drugs, possession, selling, for prostitution, solicitation, everything you could think of, people were getting done all over town for. It seriously started a war with the underground of Melbourne versus like the Victorian police. That's how bad it was. It was a war. And this investigation into the Walsh Street shootings went on for 2 years before they finally arrested Victor along with his brother Trevor and 2 of their mates, Anthony and Peter. So at this point, they had actually been speaking to Jason, the grandson, Vicky's son, and he was kind of over like the crime life. He agreed to testify against his uncles and their friends. So they were going to have him in court testifying that, yeah, they did do the fucking Walsh Street murders. So Jason's testimony put both the uncles at the scene of the crime, as well as the 2 friends and 2 other people, but they had already been killed in the past 2 years, so no one cared, they didn't matter. So this was good for the police, but alone, Jason's testimony wouldn't put them in prison, especially for the fact that he was family. So at this point, they started harassing Victor's wife, trying to, you know, get her on board to testify as well. So originally, Victor's alibi was that he was with his wife in a hotel on the night of the shootings, and his wife went on to retract that statement and say that no, she wasn't with him on the night of the shootings. And she agreed that she would testify against him in exchange for immunity. But on the day that she was supposed to testify, she retracted her retraction and didn't show up to testify. So this made her a hostile witness and meant that it was absolutely useless and they were back to only having Jason. So this actually led to all 4 men being acquitted of the murders. And because Jason had just testified against them, both him and his mum Vicky, they had to be taken into protective custody so that their family didn't kill them. I bet Vicky was like, Jason, bro, why'd you have to do this? Then in 2002, Victor was shot and he was killed in the middle of the street by like a rival gang member, and then the guy who killed him was shot in the exact same way, like in the exact same fashion, and he died as well. So goes to show the kind of environment they were in. And I think for most people, losing that many children in a violent fashion, like they were all either, you know, killed or died from drugs or, you know, just very, very violent, you would think that would be enough to sort of get you out of that lifestyle, but no, Kath just kept on kicking and she started another drug business after this time with the help of her son Trevor. So they basically fell into the same sort of routine that Kath and Dennis had originally, where Kath was cutting the drugs, packing the drugs, and then Trevor was now the one recruiting and bringing people in and then selling and distributing the drugs. What they didn't know though is that the police were building up a very big case against the entire family, and they had an undercover cop who was getting close to the family. So this cop actually got so close to Trevor that Trevor saved his life. One of the other men, you know, involved in the close circle was going to kill this undercover cop, had an issue with him, and Trevor saved his fucking life. That's how close they were. Like, this guy was gonna slit his throat. So he saved the guy, who then ended up sending him to prison. Ouch. So Trevor ended up getting 7 years, while the rest of his crew, they got, you know, each one individually got somewhere between 5 and 11 years. And Kath, she only got 18 months. She only got 18 months that was then deemed already served for the time that she spent waiting for the trial. So she didn't get anything. And this was all because the magistrate saw a high chance of rehabilitation in Kath, which, like, did she pay you off? Are you okay? Are you a drug addict? Did she sell you drugs? Is it because she's a granny? Like, what's wrong with you? Clearly there was no chance of rehabilitation. She just, fuck me, if she was young enough to pop out more kids, I think she would have, but anyway, whatever. And this was the end of the Pettingills' family reign of being the most wanted criminals in Melbourne. There's a lot of different opinions about Granny Evil, about Kath Pettingill. A lot of people believe that she was just doing what any mother would do for her sons, protecting her sons, like whatever, and think that she's a changed woman now and just an innocent old granny who deserves to be left alone. But then there's a lot of people who think, yeah, no, she was the mastermind, she was the one using them, she was like a bit manipulative. She reminds me actually of, if anyone's seen the TV show on Netflix called Animal Kingdom, she reminds me of Smurf a little bit, just in the way that her sons were doing everything. There's a lot of different opinions on Kath, and I would love to hear your opinion, so make sure you drop your comments down below and tell me what you think about Kath, what you think about her family, what you think about the sons, what you think about the drugs. Let me know, I want to hear it. Be sure to give this video a big thumbs up if you feel like it. I would really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so that you can see all my new videos I post every single Thursday all about true crime, and I would love to have you be a part of it. Make sure you guys are being safe out there. Make sure you don't use your sons to sell drugs for you, because that's exploiting your children. Don't buy a gun if you're a trigger happy nutter, because, you know, you'll go to prison for lots of years. And most importantly, never trust an old granny with a glass eye, because she might not be able to see right now, but she has seen some shit and she is dangerous. I don't care if she's a granny. She's Granny Evil, okay? Thank you guys so much for watching. Be safe out there. Bye! Oh, I'm not in the mood. And I'm not tall enough. How do I make this taller? Ugh, this is pissing me off. I knew I didn't want to film today. I knew it. I just knew it. Ah! The chair's not big enough to sit this tall.